All right, let's go ahead and fire this thing off. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Rise Up podcast. Second thing we're going to talk about is the application of the hierarchy scope within the ISA 95 standard. We've continued to field several questions about that. It seems that people are aware that this attribute exists within many of the models, but not sure exactly how to use it. So, we're going to talk about three very common applications, things we've used in practice with regard to the hierarchy scope. So, going back to it, people are familiar with the role-based equipment model. They're familiar with maybe the asset models. We've talked about resources. And even when we get into the equipment model itself in part two, there's the attributes and there's the properties that are associated with those. And it exists on more than just on equipment, although that's, I think, where people have seen it, because that's oftentimes that's the resource model that most people are familiar with as they've built it out. But if we talk about this attribute that's there, that it's called hierarchy scope, it's sort of this, well, I have my role-based equipment hierarchy. Well, what's this hierarchy scope and how does that work? So can you first just start by explaining a little bit of what hierarchy scope is and why it exists in the models?
Yeah, sure. Um, you're completely correct saying that we've got our equipment, our role-based equipment model, which also has an hierarchy inside. So we have the enterprise, we have site, area, our work centers, and our units below that. But that basically is something completely different from our hierarchy scope. So what you can do with your hierarchy scope is you can have an information object, let's call it like that. So it could be either a work calendar, could be an incoming operation schedule, or maybe something else, so a piece of information. And with our hierarchy scope, we can scope that piece of information into the equipment. So we can say for this piece of information what we have, this only applies to this piece of equipment. And that can be completely different from what we have in our role-based equipment, where we more look on how is my factory set up? What is the physical location of my equipment?
So if I understand that right, it gives you a little more flexibility in that it's not the rigidity that sometimes people have claimed that ISA 95 is. It's like, yes, there is a rigid structure that is built in, but that's okay because we've enabled certain tools like the hierarchy scope to do it. Or another common example is that we now have our equipment asset mapping to where we can have, many to many, one to many to one, those types of relationships in there. So, and I think that's why we want to spend some time talking about it, because it's, there is a lot of flexibility. This was thought of when the standard was first developed. So I think the first one we're going to talk about goes back to the work calendar itself. And if I understand it right, it's that you have the hierarchy or your role based equipment, but sometimes you have a different calendar that you want to utilize this equipment for. So can you walk us through this very first use case regarding the work calendar?
I can. What I want to suggest is that we start with a different example that starts with the relationship between the role-based equipment. So how is my equipment located in the factory against how it might be modeled in SAP or in any other ERP application? Because sometimes we
Okay.
see a mismatch, and how can we solve that? And I've got 3 examples in total, and I'm happy to go to the other one in a
No,
bit.
if it
That's
makes
okay for
more
you?
sense, then yeah, I knew there were three that we talked about. So let's do them in order that I think will help people understand exactly how we're using what we're doing. So, by all means, you're the expert. So explain it in a way that's going to be easiest for people to understand and apply.
Yeah, perfect. So on my screen, you see the typical standard role-based equipment model. This is just an example, so just for freshening up, we've got the enterprise. Under here, we have just one site, could be multiple sites as well. And it has 2 areas, 4 work centers in total. And then we have, for each work center, we have 2 units. So there can be anything. This is just an example that we're going to use in the next steps. So what I want to highlight is in the middle, that relationship, it's called is made up of. That is typically the how we build that role-based equipment hierarchy. So every level, so an enterprise has a relationship to another equipment, one to many, where it says this enterprise is made up of one or multiple sites. And that can be done the same thing with site. So your site can have one to many is made up of relationships, and that then gives you the areas. So within your equipment, your role-based equipment model, you are able to set up your complete hierarchy of your equipment. You don't need your hierarchy scope for that. Your hierarchy scope is used for something else. So we already I touched it in the in the previous discussion. So basically, our hierarchy scope, which is the object in the middle, allows information objects. That's how I call them. I don't know if that's the official name. I don't think so, but that's how I like to call them. So you can have an object that contains information and link that via the hierarchy scope to your equipment. So everything on the left side is the content of information, and the equipment which you see on the right side, that is your receiver for your equipment. So you see that an operation request, I can via the hierarchy scope map that to the equipment, but I can also do that with work calendar definitions, where we have an example from for today. But also the equipment. So you will see two equipments in your hierarchy scope. One is the information object, and the other one is the receiver of that information.
So, if I understand right, let's just say that we have the perfect plant, and I'm able just to use the role based hierarchy right out of the box as it is, and I don't need to do anything here. And you wouldn't necessarily use the hierarchy scope. But and in those manufacturing operations where I'm exchanging information, I'm going to have my equipment, I'm going to have the operations requests, the job orders, the work calendar definitions, and the like, and they're just going to sit out there, and that's that standard use case. But as we're going to get into, there's going to be some specials. There's going to be some times when we're going to need to allow a little bit of flexibility. So all I'm doing in this case is I'm taking those same objects, whether they're the resource objects or the information objects, and I'm going to overlay them with, say, this equipment hierarchy, map that back to a hierarchy scope. And then, of course, one of the pieces of that is now we'll just have that equipment. So this will be the one off, the special that allows some flexibility. But the way that I tie that all back together is through this, we'll just call it the attribute of the hierarchy scope. Is that right?
Correct. Completely correct. So in an ideal world, we could do only with the equipment, the role-based equipment model. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world, so we need to have some flexibility.
Yeah, well, I'll keep working on living in the ideal world, in which case we would never need that hierarchy scope again. So,
Yes, that
right.
would be very convenient for me as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we'll keep working on that. So, you say there was a use case you wanted to show us. So, well, let's get into
Yes.
that.
So let's show that. So this is one of my one of the examples where so in that not that ideal world, we see that the mapping between an ERP system, so the mole which is in the ERP system, does not match what is physically on in the shop floor. So typically what we want to do in our role-based equipment is model the complete equipment as is in your factory. So if so in this example, if your polishing machine one, which can be seen here, is located, is used in work center one and located in this area, that's how we model it, because that's where they physically are. It might be, or most of the time what we see is that ERP is disconnected from the shop floor, especially if there's no MES in place, it's disconnected. And it could be that over time, things are modeled differently. So in your ERPs, we've got a different view and also financial view of your factory instead of the equipment itself. Scheduling is often done in in ERP. So it could be that if you receive an order from ERP into your MES layer, that matching is not a one-to-one relationship. So you can see that you cannot schedule to the same factory, or you receive a different location of that information of your operation schedule. So what we can do, here on the left side, we see our hole-based equipment, which is identical to the one that I showed you earlier. And on the right side, we have an hierarchy scope that is especially designed to match the model, which is an ERP. So in this example in ERP, we have an enterprise that's got two masons, so 1 and 2. And in there we have directly work center A, B, C, and D. And work center A has the polishing machine X1 and X2, but the manual machines are located at work center B. So here on the left side, we don't have a work center A and B, and also the grouping is different because we see that work center X1 has the first two machines. So what we can do here is ERP can schedule something on work center A. So we say we receive an operation schedule for work center A, and then with those translations, what we can do is say, okay, if something enters in work center A, you need to map that out. So these are hierarchy scope elements. You need that out to polishing machine X1 and X2. And that then has a relationship to your receiving equipment. So by doing this, I can receive an operation schedule for work center A, and then it's mapped to the receiving equipment.
Excellent. So if I understand, part of the reason why this is created is that the ERP and your MES are really looking at two different things. So ERP is more around an accounting standpoint. We're going to paint with a broad brush here, where MES is the name which suggests it's about the actual manufacturing execution. And in the days of yore, when we had clipboards, it really wasn't such a big deal. But now that we want to exchange some information automatically, ERP more focused on accounting aspects. Versus the MES on the execution, we need to have ability to at least allow for, we'll just maybe call it that virtual clipboard, if you will, of getting to the data the right spot.
Correct. Yep.
All right. Perfect.
So it's mapping of that information into the correct equipment.
Excellent. And imagine you run into this a lot because ERPs were probably set up many years ago without this being considered, and now we've got to make it work. So hierarchy scope's one way of doing that.
Yeah, I would say from what I've seen in the past is that this is the number one use case where we use it for. Okay. So to translate that model from ERP into our equipment model.
All right, excellent. Well, I think if we're ready to move into example 2, let's do that. This is the work calendar mapping. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you have equipment for one reason or another that is operating on some kind of different calendar. Maybe there are people that come in a different shift, or there's people that, it's around the availability of people, or, there's some reason, but regardless of whatever it is, they actually follow some kind of different schedule on that. And we need the ability to, again, exchange some information. So, walk us through this one, Jeroen.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So in this use case, we have our same factory, and the complete factory is running on the same work schedule. So we're talking about maybe 3 shifts, or maybe just 9 to 5 or whatever, but the complete enterprise is running on the same work schedule, with exception of 4 equipment. So here we see that those 4 machines, which are in red, they have a different schedule. So maybe they only operate in the morning, or they have a different schedule from what we see. So how the way that we solve that here is we built a hierarchy scope for our shift configuration, and we have that same enterprise to link to the enterprise, and then we have a site object which we already link to the role-based equipment site. And what that allows us to do is to define a work calendar definition and apply that to the site. And that means that everything, all the child elements under that site will use this work calendar definition. So by just defining it in one location, everything got inherited and all the other items automatically get that work calendar definition. The next step, what we do is we create like a virtual area called manual. And in there, we put hierarchy scope objects that represent those machines. So we have one for polishing machine 1, for X2, for manual machine I1 and I2. And these map out to your physical equipment. And within that manual area, we can then link a different work calendar, which overrides the previous one. And the benefit of doing this is that, yes, we can have that work calendar, but that can only link to one item. So that means that we should, if we don't do this, if we don't use this, you need to have that work calendar defined on every piece of equipment here. And with the structure that we have here, we can do inheritance of work calendars. And we only have one location where we define and maintain that work calendar.
Yeah, so in this example, you've talked about a manual polishing step, and it might be because we only have the people that do that manual polishing available during certain times. One of the questions that have come up here recently about how do we as manufacturers, how do we lower our overall, say, energy consumption? And one of those things is by putting or manufacturing those items that are more energy intensive, maybe only making those during a period of the day when there's not as much demand for electricity or some other source of energy. Would that be a good reason to use a work calendar or this type of example, just so that we have a different schedule for when certain things can be made?
Yeah, definitely. Also, this is just an example with your work calendar definition. But you can also connect your operations capabilities, where you say, okay, we've got less capability during those hours because we have less power available.
Yeah, that's going to be my follow-up question. And going back to that initial one, now all of the job orders and the operations requests and all those other objects that are going to be associated, it's not just the calendar here that's going to have it. All those other pieces are going to have them too.
Yeah, there are a lot of items that are using that hierarchy scope to map your information into your equipment model.
All right, perfect. Anything else we should talk about on example 2 before we move on?
No, I think we covered this part.
All right, perfect. Well, I'm very much looking forward to this last example because, as I've mentioned before, I'm a big believer in reliability and availability of equipment, and I think this one is all around maintenance. And again, in the perfect world, we're going to have all the same things are going to be equal. It's going to be easily done, but rarely are we able to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, we have use cases where the OEMs of equipment, they're now actually going to start providing data access. And one of the use cases that have come out of this is the ability to schedule people to come out of, we have a person in your area working on someone else's equipment. Should we come by and maybe work on yours? It looks like you're about due for some kind of maintenance. And if I understand this next schedule right, we're going to do the same type of thing. Maybe it's external, maybe it's internal, but regardless, that we can start now maintaining all of the equipment of when the technician's in the area or the person that does this, we want to start grouping that together. So if we can now advance to example 3 and walk us through what you have there.
So here we have the same factory on the left side. I keep that the same because we can see that, okay, you can definitely have different views on the same equipment. And indeed, this one is using maintenance. So let's say that we've got a set of equipment, and that set of equipment has different intervals. So in this example, I split the equipment into automatic and manual equipment, but it could also be a vendor. So maybe we have vendor A, vendor B, and they all require different interval and different checks to be done. So here we have the same idea. So we have an enterprise that has a site, and our site has got two maintenance areas, which are virtual areas that we use to group or to configure certain information objects to. Then within that maintenance area A, in this case, I placed all the automatic machines, and in maintenance area M, that is the manual one. So there you see the other ones. And they one-to-one have a relationship. So this this hierarchy scope element has a link to this equipment, and this a hierarchy scope element has a link to this equipment, and so they are all built up. So what that allows us to do is to say, okay, I've got my maintenance area 1, or maybe vendor A, that has its own set of work calendar definitions. So maybe a maintenance interval of every month that certain checks need to be done, or on a weekly basis. And on top of that, we can also have our test specifications. And in there, we can specify what kind of checks that we need to do, or what kind of maintenance that we need to do. So maybe an example is measure the current of a motor, or some kind of pressure check. That's everything that we can link. So again, the benefit of doing this is that we have only one location where we link those test specifications and work calendar definitions. So there's no need to maintain those items on every equipment itself. We have one grouped element where we can link that information object.
Excellent. So yeah, there's three really great examples, and now that you've gone through and explained it, it makes a heck of a lot more sense. In the sense that we talked about those information objects earlier. Understand that this is just the one aspect of it. This is the driving force behind it. But once you start including that hierarchy scope, provides a lot of flexibility that's in that. So as we come back to the very beginning, we talked about digital maturity. It's very important for you to follow that digital maturity. It's much like a child. You have to crawl, you have to stand, you have to walk, you have to run. Much the same thing here. You have to computerize. You have to start collecting it. You have to understand what is happening and why it's happening, and then what will happen. And then of course, scale those out. So it's very critical to follow those. And again, as we talked about, the steps of moving through those is becoming a lot faster because there's been plenty of people that have paved that way. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about the hierarchy scope in terms of what it is and how it gets used in three very, very straightforward common applications, and why we see hierarchy scope getting used. So as we finish up this podcast, Jeroen, is there anything that you would like to add on either the digital maturity or the hierarchy scope? Maybe some key takeaways here?
I think especially if we look at those, the maturity ladder, don't think that you're just in one step. So it could be that some parts of your factory are in a different location and are more advanced because you run into the need for information in the past, and therefore that's evolved a bit more than other items. I think it's an iterative process where you always need to see, do I have all the information to go to the next step, and then circle back. So don't think it's just I'm here. It's not black and white. It's a dynamic range where you're moving in, and sometimes you just need to go back to collect a bit more information to connect the next sensor, the next equipment to move the whole thing up in the next step.
Yeah, so it's kind of like fits and starts, and it's so oops, got to head back. So excellent point, excellent takeaway with that. So anything on hierarchy scope before we end?
So for the hierarchy scope, we looked into three examples. What I wanted to show is that although we have like a physical role-based equipment, which I always like to model as it is in the factory. I cannot highlight that enough, but don't change that. It's there and it just has one location beside of shared equipment. But and then the hierarchy scope gives you so much flexibility. We only looked into three examples where we either can have information stream from an external application going to one location, or connect things like work calendar definitions or test specifications. But there are so many more options to group information and maintain information in one location, and then link that to where that information should be. So yeah, just have a look at it and try it out. I'm quite sure you will come up with more different use cases than we just talked about today.
All right, excellent. Well, Jeroen, thank you so much for being on the podcast again. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in and listening. That's all we have for today. So again, thanks for listening, and see you on future episodes of the Rhize Up podcast.